Good morning, everyone. I'm Brad Roberts, the Director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today for a discussion of prospects for the upcoming NPT Review Conference, and to welcome back to the center Bob Einhorn from the Brookings Institution. Let me do a little bit to set the context before turning it over to Bob. Every 5 years or so, states party to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty gather to take stock of their collective progress in achieving the purposes and objectives of the treaty and trying to agree to next steps. In fact, agreed statements at the end of the review conferences are a great rarity, and their absence leads many people to conclude that the review conferences are failures, when in fact their success or failure shouldn't ride solely on the question of whether they produce an agreed statement upon their conclusion. Each review conference brings with it a long list of frustrations, concerns, competing agendas, and a lot of fretting about the intensifying pressure on the regime and its possible collapse. Every 5 years, we hear about the intensifying pressure, the looming collapse, and this is a continuing theme in the politics, international politics, and domestic politics of the NPT. This time again, there's a lot of reason to worry about the situation. Relative to 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the last review conference in 2015, there have been many erosions in the associated factors. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is where it is. In the last 5 years, North Korea has continued to make progress in flouting its international obligations and developing and deploying nuclear-armed long-range missiles. Obviously, there's been an even worse falling out among the major powers. New questions about the capability of the Security Council to perform its functions in support of nonproliferation. And of course, the arrival of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as an alternative, maybe a competitor, but certainly a complicator of the global nonproliferation landscape. So to help us right-size our expectations for the review conference, but put it in its context, its proper context, I'm very pleased to welcome back to CGSR Mr. Robert Einhorn. Bob's been with us regularly over the years to share his expertise on one or another aspect of these problems. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he focuses on arms control and nonproliferation in the context of his affiliation with the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology. Bob joined Brookings in 2013, having served from 2009 to 2013 in the Obama administration. Early in his tenure, he was a key player in the Nuclear Posture Review and its implementation. He served as special advisor to the Secretary of State for Nonproliferation and Arms Control, a position that was essentially created for him. He has served in prior roles in the State Department. He played a role in the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency before its untimely demise. And he's been a leading player in the think tank community between government roles, including as a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Bob has a bachelor's degree in government from Cornell and a master's in public affairs and international relations from Princeton University. Bob's going to make about 45 minutes of introductory remarks. Those will be on the record. Then we'll switch to the Q&A portion, which will be off the record. If you'd like to join the discussion at that point, please raise your hand electronically. If you'd rather send me a message in the chat function, that would work too. Bob, thanks so much for making the time to join us today. Thank you for your leadership on these issues. Over to you. Bob, you're muted up. Sorry.
Thanks a lot, Brad, for inviting me, and I thank all the participants for listening in. The 10th NPT review conference would have taken place in 2020, which is the 50th anniversary of the NPT's entry into force. But the conference was postponed a few times because of the pandemic and is now likely to take place in early 2022. A decision on timing will probably be made later on this month. Now, what I'd like to do is discuss prospects for that upcoming review conference, but I'd also like to address a key problem in the way review conferences have been conducted, explain how the United States has typically approached these conferences, and provide my assessment of the relationship, and I'd say tenuous relationship between these NPT review conferences and the real world of nuclear proliferation. I approach these issues as someone who's been a member of the US delegation to 5 of the 9 review conferences held so far, including the first one, which was in 1975, and the most important one, the 1995 conference that decided to make the NPT permanent. I guess I'd be considered a card-carrying member of the so-called nonproliferation community. But I've become cynical about NPT, about the NPT review process, and some of my comments are likely to strike you as heretical. RevCons, to use the NPT lingo, are meetings of NPT parties held at 5-year intervals. The purpose of these RevCons, to quote NPT Article 8, is to review the operation of the treaty with a view to ensuring that the purposes of the preamble and the provisions of the treaty are being realized. Now, that's all the guidance the treaty provides. It doesn't say what kind of final document should be produced by the RevCon. Indeed, it doesn't require that any final document be produced. Yet the goal of every RevCon, starting with the first one in 1975, has been to produce a comprehensive final document that evaluates how well the NPT has worked so far and provides recommendations for strengthening it. And perhaps most important, the parties have insisted that the final document be approved by consensus, and that in the absence of consensus, there would be no final document at all, no collective written record of the conference. In other words, all or nothing. In theory, there is considerable value in achieving a consensus outcome. It can demonstrate a shared interest of NPT parties in promoting the success of the treaty. It can give impetus to new proposals for advancing the goals of the nonproliferation regime. And it can provide an incentive for the parties to reach substantive compromises for the sake of a successful conference. But in practice, the costs of insisting on a consensus outcome have often outweighed the benefits. Agreement on a wide range of individual issues may be held hostage to agreement on the most contentious ones. Useful initiatives that command broad conference support receive no endorsement or even acknowledgement if disagreements on one or more of these contentious issues block a conference final outcome. Insisting on consensus also means that parties devote an inordinate amount of time and energy to trying to hammer out agreed formulations on a small number of the most controversial issues. And this comes at the expense of conference activities that, in my view, could more meaningfully contribute to advancing nonproliferation objectives, such as assessing the impact of technological developments on the global nonproliferation regime, or engaging in detailed discussions of new proposals for strengthening the regime. Moreover, insisting on consensus rarely promotes real substantive compromises. Many NPT parties, especially among the non-aligned group, believe the consensus requirement gives them leverage to compel other parties, often the United States, to make concessions they would not otherwise make. But most countries, and especially the United States, are unwilling to compromise what they consider to be important national interests for the sake of a consensus conference outcome. Largely as a result of the conventional rule, as well as the insistence of parties to cover all NPT-related issues under the sun in a document of unmanageable size, only 4 of the 9 review conferences held to date have managed to produce a consensus final document. The issue that has most often blocked consensus and will surely be a source of discord at the upcoming RevCon is nuclear disarmament. Many NPT non-nuclear weapon states, including both the non-aligned but also Western countries such as Austria and Ireland, have argued that the NPT nuclear weapon states, mainly the United States and Russia, have not done nearly enough to comply with their obligation in NPT Article 6 to pursue nuclear disarmament. They claim that the nuclear weapon states are not fulfilling their end of the so-called NPT bargain, the idea that the NPT is a compact between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, in which non-nuclear weapon states join the NPT and renounce their own nuclear weapons capabilities in exchange for a commitment by the nuclear weapon states to eventually achieve nuclear disarmament. But in my view, this interpretation of the NPT's purpose is a distortion. The motivation of the principal countries leading the NPT negotiations in the 1960s was clear. It was to prevent additional nuclear-armed states. For the United States, that meant avoiding JFK's nightmare vision of a world of many nuclear powers. For the Soviet Union, it meant avoiding challenges to its post-war international position, especially preventing a nuclear-armed Germany. Some non-nuclear weapon state participants in the NPT negotiations felt very strongly that the division of the world into nuclear haves and have-nots should not last forever. They also wish to ensure that renouncing nuclear weapons does not mean forswearing the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And so Article 6 on disarmament and Article 4 on peaceful uses were added to the treaty to address these concerns. But those provisions fell far short of what their sponsors wanted, and didn't alter the NPT's essential purpose. It was a non-proliferation treaty, not a nuclear disarmament treaty or a peaceful nuclear energy promotion treaty. But over the decades, the idea of an NPT bargain, that nuclear abstinence by non-nuclear weapon states had to be balanced by nuclear weapon state disarmament and would not be sustainable without it, has become generally accepted in NPT lore. A closely related feature of long accepted NPT lore is that the NPT is based on 3 pillars: disarmament, non-proliferation, and peaceful uses, and that a lack of sufficient progress on one of those pillars would cause the entire structure to collapse. These constructs have contributed to polarization within the NPT's membership. The original theory of the NPT was that preventing additional nuclear-armed states would serve the interest of all states. Indeed, it would especially serve the interest of non-nuclear weapon states. After all, nuclear weapon states had their own nuclear weapons to defend themselves and were less threatened by proliferation, whereas the NPT would be of special value to non-nuclear weapon states by decreasing the likelihood that their neighbors and rivals would acquire nuclear weapons. But as the idea of the NPT bargain took hold, activist non-nuclear weapon states tended to downplay the value of nonproliferation for them and to act as if their main interest in joining and adhering to the NPT was to ensure the reduction of existing nuclear arsenals and the threat that those arsenals pose to themselves and to civilization in general. As a result, a significant number of non-nuclear weapon states, again, especially among the non-aligned, have resisted additional practical measures aimed at curbing proliferation. They argue that such measures are not justified as long as the nuclear weapon states fail to meet their obligations to pursue nuclear disarmament. Arguments about the balance among the NPT's so-called pillars have long divided RevCon participants have been a principal reason why consensus final outcomes have been so difficult to achieve. As NPT parties prepare for the upcoming RevCon, especially its handling of nuclear disarmament and related Article 6 issues, they're aware of a key factor that has changed since April 2020, when the 50th anniversary RevCon was originally scheduled to take place. And that factor is that Joe Biden has replaced Donald Trump as President of the United States. The change has produced optimism that the Biden administration can help deliver a more positive conference outcome than could have been achieved under his predecessor. After all, Vice President Biden was a key player in an administration that spoke about a world without nuclear weapons, that negotiated a new START and called for further reductions, that favored ratification of the CTBT, that ruled out the use of nuclear weapons against NPT non-nuclear weapon states compliant with their obligations, and supported the 2010 Review Conference Plan of Action that outlined a wide range of steps in support of Article 6. And NPT parties are aware that in his final days as vice president, Biden expressed what he called his personal view that the sole purpose of US nuclear weapons should be to deter nuclear attack against the United States and its allies and respond to such an attack. They're also aware that one of Biden's first acts as president was to agree with the Russians on extending New START for 5 years. And many of them have probably read the Biden administration's Interim National Security Strategic Guidance, which states, and I'll quote, "We will address the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons. We will head off costly arms races and reestablish our credibility as a leader in arms control. Where possible, we will also pursue new arms control agreements. We will take steps to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy." But those who are counting on President Biden to turn the clock back to the heady days of the Prague Agenda and engineer a forward-leaning RevCon consensus on nuclear disarmament issues should keep their expectations in check. The international security environment, as Brad has pointed out, has sharply deteriorated since 2010, with Russia, China, and North Korea advancing their strategic capabilities, acting assertively in their regions, and posing growing threats to the United States and its allies. Prospects for further nuclear reductions are remote for the foreseeable future. The US arms control agenda in the period ahead will be devoted to reducing the risks of armed conflict that could escalate to the nuclear level and reconceptualizing strategic stability at a time of emerging technologies and additional nuclear players, especially China. NPT parties with high hopes for the Biden team should also recall that when the Obama administration spoke about reducing the role and number of nuclear weapons, it also emphasized its commitment to ensuring that the U.S. nuclear deterrent will remain safe, secure, and effective, a commitment reaffirmed in the Biden administration's interim national security guidance. And while it proposed further nuclear reductions below New START levels, the Obama administration also supported an ambitious strategic modernization program, which was essentially adopted by the Trump administration, received strong bipartisan support, and is likely to survive largely intact under the Biden administration. Moreover, given the Biden administration's central national security goal of reinforcing U.S. alliances, it will be reluctant to do anything that casts doubt on the credibility of U.S. extended nuclear deterrent. In time, we will see what that means for the Biden administration's position on sole purpose. NPT parties should also recognize that the timing of the administration's strategic posture reviews will affect what it will be able to say or do at the upcoming review conference. Those strategic reviews have not yet begun. My understanding, and Brad, you can correct me on this, is that White House guidance for conducting the reviews has not yet been issued. It seems extremely unlikely that the reviews will be completed in time to have a major impact on the positions the U.S. delegation will take at the RevCon. Clearly, the tone of the Biden administration's participation at the RevCon will be different from what might have been expected from a Trump administration. And some of the general principles and positions articulated by the Biden-led delegation will be music to the ears of many conference participants. But if parties are counting on major changes in U.S. policies on nuclear disarmament and related issues, they are likely to be disappointed. The reality is that there is a substantial continuity in U.S. strategic policies from one administration to the next. All U.S. administrations have strongly supported the NPT and wanted to see successful review conference outcomes that reinforce the effectiveness of the treaty as a barrier to nuclear proliferation. But no administration has been willing to alter its strategic policies or programs for the sake of an NPT review conference. When administrations have taken positions at RevCons that were widely welcomed and contributed to consensus outcomes, it was because those positions had already been adopted for national security reasons, having little to do with the desire to promote a harmonious conference. And when the administrations of both parties have been confronted with the choice between altering a national security policy to ensure a consensus or maintaining that policy and blocking the consensus, they have invariably chosen to stick to their guns and block the consensus. For the most part, U.S. administrations have regarded NPT RevCons as damage-limiting exercises. They arrive at the conference prepared to defend the U.S. record, especially in pursuing nuclear disarmament, but also in promoting the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, facilitating progress toward a WMZ zone in the Middle East, and working toward other goals likely to figure prominently at the RevCon. They also approach RevCons with a wide range of affirmative objectives, such as encouraging universal adherence to the additional protocol, curbing the spread of fuel cycle capabilities, strengthening cooperation in interdicting illicit nuclear transfers, and enforcing strict compliance with non-proliferation obligations. But they know they'll encounter resistance to several of their affirmative objectives. And rather than pressing hard for major advances on such issues at the RevCon, they'll usually settle for watered down formulations that break little, if any, new ground, knowing that they can pursue those objectives more successfully outside the NPT review process. On rare occasions, the US had affirmative goals it felt it had to achieve. The most significant example was at the 1995 review conference, when the US went all out in the successful effort to produce a conference decision to extend the NPT indefinitely. In that case, the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, and other senior administration officials were all personally involved in ensuring that result. Never before or since has an NPT review conference received such high-level attention. Administrations may be able to wheel out the Secretary of State or even higher to read a US opening statement. But in general, NPT review conferences are not a very high priority in Washington. They are seen more as challenges than opportunities. That's unlikely to change fundamentally at the upcoming review conference, even if, as expected, the Biden administration tries hard to demonstrate that the US is back as a leader of international nonproliferation efforts. Despite a measure of goodwill that NPT parties can be expected to show toward the Biden administration, the upcoming review is likely to be just as contentious as previous ones. And now I'd like to highlight a few of the issues that I think may prove divisive. One such issue is the current status of recommendations adopted by consensus at previous review conferences. A prime example is the 64-point plan of action included in the 2010 consensus final document, which contained a range of forward-leaning items on Article 6 related issues. A large number of states, including a significant number of Western countries, maintain that previous consensus decisions remain binding on NPT parties. If not binding in a strict legal sense, then at least binding as solemn political commitments that should continue to guide the behavior of the parties despite any changes in national policies or international circumstances. The United States does not share this view, regardless of whether Republicans or Democrats are in power. The US holds that previous consensus recommendations are important expressions of the collective political will of NPT parties at a particular point of time and under particular circumstances. And according to this view, these consensus recommendations help set the international agenda on NPT-related issues, at least in the near term, but they should not be expected to guide behavior indefinitely. It's up to each RevCon to consider and hopefully agree on the priorities and recommendations for the period directly ahead. The only previous RevCon decision that the United States considers legally binding is the 1995 decision to make the NPT permanent. That's because NPT Article 10 provided for a future review conference decision on whether and for how long to extend the treaty, which was initially of 25-year duration. By giving its advice and consent to NPT ratification, the Senate was giving a future US administration authority to bind the US to an extension decision. It's unclear whether or how this issue of past RevCon decisions will be resolved. Perhaps the parties can set aside the question of the status of previous decisions and agree that review conferences should be required to specifically address previous recommendations and consider whether and the extent to which those recommendations should be reaffirmed. Of the substantive issues to be addressed at the upcoming RevCon, nuclear disarmament and related Article 6 issues will be among the most divisive. Although the Biden administration and Russia will get some credit for agreeing to the 5-year extension of New START, countries that are strong advocates of disarmament are likely to adopt a posture of "what have you done for me lately?" They'll criticize the strategic modernization programs of the nuclear powers, the demise of the INF and Open Skies agreements, and the absence of new strategic arms agreements for 11 years and counting. They'll call for further nuclear reductions, curtailment of modernization programs, ratification of the CTBT, and the de-alerting of nuclear forces. They'll concede that nuclear risk reduction measures should be pursued at a time when the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons may have increased, but they will be adamant that such risk reduction measures are not a substitute for formal nuclear arms reduction agreements. The 5 NPT nuclear weapon states will defend their strategic modernization programs and seek credit for their efforts in the P5 consultative process, including their work on nuclear doctrine and their intention to focus on nuclear risk reduction measures. The United States and Russia will claim that their long record of bilateral strategic arms agreements demonstrates their compliance with NPT Article 6, and they'll also point out that their bilateral strategic stability talks, which may be underway by the time of the review conference, will help pave the way for future agreements. Washington and Moscow could use the RevCon as an occasion to reaffirm the Reagan-Gorbachev statement that a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. The Trump administration was not prepared to endorse that statement, supposedly because it believed that a nuclear war could be won against North Korea. The Biden administration could part with its predecessor in other ways as well. It could express its support for ratifying the CTBT, although it would have no credible plan for making that happen and no serious intention to pursue it. And it could return to the Obama administration's seemingly more restrictive approach regarding circumstances in which it would consider using nuclear weapons. For example, by not reiterating the Trump administration's position that it might consider the use of nuclear weapons in response to various types of non-nuclear strategic attacks, such as non-nuclear attacks against civilian populations or critical infrastructure. Current intense rivalries among NPT nuclear powers could pose a serious obstacle to achieving a positive review conference outcome. In the past, the P5 were usually able to set aside their differences and work together in support of their shared interest in a strong NPT. Prospects for a consensus outcome at the upcoming RevCon could depend on whether, despite increasingly adversarial bilateral relationships, they are able to find common ground and work cooperatively again. On an issue on which they are sure to find common ground, but that puts them at odds with many other NPT parties and could jeopardize a consensus, is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW. The treaty, which purports to outlaw nuclear weapons and seeks to delegitimize nuclear deterrence, has the support of a majority of NPT parties and is already entered into force. Proponents claim that it complements the NPT by accelerating the NPT's disarmament goals. But the TPNW is strongly opposed by all NPT nuclear weapon states and by countries that rely on the US nuclear umbrella for their security. They maintain that the TPNW will do nothing to promote disarmament, could undermine the deterrence many countries rely on for their security, and could lead to erosion of support for the NPT. The likelihood of TPNW playing a disruptive role at the RevCon will depend on whether TPNW advocates are intent on getting conference participants to endorse their positive assessments of the treaty. For example, that it complements the NPT and will promote disarmament. If not, it may be possible for them and the nuclear weapon states to agree on a neutral, factual statement, simply noting that the TPNW has entered into force and indicating how many states have become parties. Another issue that could stand in the way of consensus and actually blocked consensus at the 2015 review conference is the Middle East WMD free zone. Since the 1995 review conference adopted a resolution calling for such a zone, Egypt has taken the lead in denouncing the lack of progress toward achieving the zone, pointing its finger at Israel for blocking progress and ignoring the absence of conditions in the Middle East that could permit a WMD-free zone to be realized. The Egyptians know that conditions aren't right, and that Israel is not the only obstacle, especially given Iran's desire to keep its nuclear weapons option open, Saudi Arabia's determination to match Iran, Erdogan's possible nuclear aspirations, and Syria's extensive use of chemical weapons against its own people, not to mention past aborted efforts by Iraq, Libya, and Syria to acquire nuclear weapons. But the Egyptians enjoyed the political stage that a Revcon provides for a country that was once the unrivaled leader of the Arab world. And the consensus rule allows them and other Arab delegations to hold a review conference hostage and ensures that their zone proposals will get the attention, if not the approval, of NPT parties. There's hope that the zone issue will be easier to handle at the upcoming RevCon than at previous RevCons. A 2018 UN General Assembly resolution called for annual conferences under UN auspices to pursue the Middle East zone. The first such conference was held in November 2019. Israel and the US did not attend because agreement could not be reached on an agenda that Israel considered non-prejudicial. Egypt and other Arab states will undoubtedly wish to see the zone issue addressed at the upcoming RevCon. But the fact that they now have another venue to pursue that goal may make them less insistent on using the RevCon to seek endorsement of proposals that proved controversial at past reviewed conferences. A wide range of other issues will be debated at the RevCon, most of them less likely to stand in the way of consensus. Iran and the JCPOA will surely be addressed. It's hard to predict whether at the time the RevCon is finally held, the JCPOA will be restored, negotiations will still be underway, or the deal will already have collapsed. JCPOA restoration would be welcomed by the RevCon. If negotiations on re-entry are still going on, the RevCon would encourage their completion. In the event of collapse, the continued buildup of Iran's nuclear capacity and the increased tensions surrounding that buildup would elevate the importance of Iran on the RevCon agenda. But both the Biden administration and the more conservative Iranian administration likely to assume office after the June presidential election may still be interested in reaching a deal, and neither would want the RevCon's handling of the Iran nuclear issue to complicate the path back to diplomacy. And so both Washington and Tehran might join a simple RevCon consensus that calls for mutual restraint and encourages diplomatic efforts to resolve the nuclear issue. North Korea will also be addressed at the RevCon. Like on Iran, it's not clear where things will stand at the time of the conference, whether US DPRK engagement will have begun, or whether in the absence of diplomatic engagement, Pyongyang will have resumed serious provocations, such as nuclear or ICBM range missile tests. But even if the situation has become a lot more tense, the default option in a RevCon final document might simply be to reiterate the language of existing UN Security Council resolutions, calling on the DPRK to cease its provocations, agree to denuclearization, and return to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. A conference result that would be facilitated by North Korea's non-participation in the conference and therefore its inability to block a consensus. As in previous RevCons, the US and other delegations will support various non-proliferation proposals, such as making the additional protocol the universal standard for NPT verification, or preventing the abuse of the NPT's withdrawal provision. But as in previous RevCons, some parties will resist such proposals, arguing that NPT non-nuclear weapon states should not be required to accept additional limitations on what they consider to be their rights, as long as the nuclear weapon states refuse to do more to fulfill their nuclear disarmament obligations. And as they have done in the past, the United States and other supporters of such proposals will settle for watered down versions that don't do much to move the ball forward. Many observers of NPT matters doubt that a consensus outcome can be achieved at the upcoming conference. They point to sharp differences on some of the substantive issues I have identified, and they believe current international conditions, including adversarial relations among the NPT nuclear powers, will pose obstacles to reaching consensus. Other observers are not so pessimistic. They believe that parties that strongly advocate disarmament may be prepared to scale back their demands and settle for much more modest outcomes than they would prefer in order to avoid putting additional stress on the NPT. And these optimists also point out that two of the most contentious issues, the TPNW and the Middle East zone, are now being handled outside the NPT review process, which may decrease the likelihood that they will become deal breakers at the upcoming conference. Whatever the odds of producing a consensus outcome, conference participants will almost surely aim for that result, as they've always done. If they manage to succeed, fine, even if it means relying on diplomatic formulations to paper over differences rather than resolve them. But if late in the 4-week conference they seem headed for a train wreck with irreconcilable differences that can't be papered over, I believe the parties should abandon the effort to reach a comprehensive consensus and shift to a Plan B. Under Plan B, a conference final outcome would be adopted that contained both consensus elements as well as elements that were unable to obtain a consensus. Specific recommendations able to achieve consensus support would be explicitly endorsed in a conference final document. At previous RevCons, the failure to achieve an overall conference consensus would mean no final document at all, and such specific recommendations would receive no recognition. And under Plan B, even proposals and recommendations that did not gain the full support of conference participants would be recorded in the final document, where they would be available to inform future international deliberations. I've been an advocate of Plan B for several years. I've discussed it extensively with foreign diplomats, including several designated to become the principal officers of the upcoming review conference. My impression is that especially among officials from Western countries, there's a lot of sympathy for abandoning the all or nothing approach and moving to some version of Plan B. But they're reluctant to express support for Plan B at this stage. They know that any hint that they favor dropping the consensus requirement would trigger a fierce backlash from non-aligned supporters of the consensus or nothing approach. I believe the intention of conference leaders is to make a major effort to achieve a consensus outcome. But if and when that proves unachievable, I think the conference officers, together with the United States and many like-minded delegations, will seek to engineer a shift to Plan B. But in the end, that might not work. Several delegations may prefer to see the conference go down in flames rather than accept the abandonment of the consensus requirement they believe is the source of their clout on NPT-related issues. So I see three possible outcomes of the upcoming review conference. One is a a comprehensive final document approved by consensus. A second is failure to achieve such a document, but approval of a Plan B document containing both consensus and non-consensus elements. Both of those outcomes would be regarded as successes. A third possible outcome is failure to achieve a comprehensive consensus document, failure to agree on a Plan B, and therefore failure to produce any final document. Many observers, especially from the nonproliferation community, would regard outcome 3 as a significant failure and potentially a serious setback for the NPT and the broader nonproliferation regime. Such an outcome would certainly not be positive for the global nonproliferation regime, but our experience tells us that the impact would not be nearly as damaging as some would predict. If the litmus test for a successful review conference is consensus approval of a comprehensive final document, then RevCons have failed more than half the time. Yet those supposed failures have had little negative impact on the nonproliferation regime. Indeed, some of the major gains for the regime occurred in the wake of RevCons that failed to produce any written outcome. For example, in the period shortly after the failed, I say failed in air quotes, in the period shortly after the failed 1990 RevCon, South Africa dismantled its small nuclear arsenal. Iraq's nuclear program was eliminated. Work began on the IAEA additional protocol. China, Brazil, and Argentina joined the NPT. The Convention on Nuclear Safety was concluded, and the Nuclear Suppliers Group made full scope IAEA safeguards a condition of nuclear supply to NPT non-parties. In fact, there's very little correlation between the outcome of RevCons and the health of the global nonproliferation regime. An important reason for this is the disconnect between what goes on at NPT conferences and developments in the real world of nuclear proliferation and non-proliferation. Take the nuclear disarmament issue. If you listen to speeches at NPT gatherings, you might believe that the current impasse on nuclear arms control and the alleged failure of NPT nuclear weapon states to fulfill their end of the NPT bargain will lead a number of non-nuclear weapon states to leave the NPT and perhaps pursue nuclear weapons. But historically, progress in nuclear disarmament has had nothing to do with decisions to acquire or renounce nuclear weapons, which are driven mainly by regional security and political considerations, as well as domestic factors. The calls for nuclear disarmament at NPT gatherings are undoubtedly sincere, but the ardent positions taken by mid-level diplomats at such meetings rarely reflect the priority attached to nuclear disarmament at the highest levels of their governments. If they did, their heads of government or foreign ministers would raise the issue of nuclear disarmament with their US or other foreign counterparts, but they almost never do so. The NPT review process has lost its way. It's becoming an opportunity for dramatic diplomatic showdowns with finger-pointing, political gamesmanship, and desperate 11th hour drafting sessions, but only rarely with concrete results that advance the goals of the treaty. The Biden administration will approach the upcoming RevCon constructively and respectively. It will work hard for a positive outcome, whether that outcome is a consensus final document or some variant of Plan B. But the Biden administration, like previous administrations, won't count on the review conference to advance its non-proliferation goals. It knows that polarization within the NPT's membership has essentially paralyzed the NPT review process. Instead, it will count on policy approaches the US has traditionally relied on. such as strengthening national and multilateral export controls, interdicting illicit proliferation transfers, imposing US and multilateral sanctions to penalize violations of non-proliferation norms and agreements, discouraging the acquisition of nuclear fuel cycle capabilities, enhancing the gathering of proliferation-related intelligence, using diplomatic pressure to encourage responsible behavior, negotiating non-proliferation constraints with countries like Iran and North Korea, protecting nuclear facilities and materials against theft or seizure by non-state actors, and not least, reinforcing the reliability of security guarantees to US allies. Very few of these critical non-proliferation policies can be successfully pursued at NPT review conferences. Now, I'm not saying that NPT review conferences have become irrelevant. It's essential that NPT parties, despite their differing priorities, continue to regard the NPT as indispensable to reducing nuclear dangers and promoting international security. And it's essential that frustrations about NPT implementation, including dissatisfaction with the pace of nuclear disarmament, not get to the point where they erode the authority of the NPT as a political and technical barrier to nuclear proliferation. That's why it's important for the US and like-minded countries to take the review conference seriously and to do their best to promote a harmonious outcome. But if the US wishes to sustain the remarkably successful record of the last 30 years, with no additional countries acquiring nuclear weapons, it will have to look to the policies I've just described and not to the NPT review process. Brad, I'm going to finish right there.